About a month ago, we were warned. Ukraine war-related inflation may drive protests and riots, and that came from the World Bank. Now, we're starting to see the beginning of food and fuel riots. Starting in Peru, we see protests show the wide impact of Putin's war. So saith CNN. Well, they're partly right. Vladimir Putin, Russia, they invaded Ukraine. This contributed to rising prices. It contributed to food shortages. But the West also has some blame in the matter. Now, of course, we can all just say outright, yeah, Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. This is terrible. But the U.S. decided to get involved. NATO decided to get involved. And what they did was sanction. It's what they do best, right? Now, some sanctions are not that big of a deal and probably could be good to push back on Russia in a way that doesn't trigger World War III. But in this instance, what we're seeing in Eastern Europe, I don't think would be solved by sanctions. And now we're realizing it's not. In fact, it looks like sanctions may be backfiring. The ruble has recovered. Russia is now creating their own payment system. Russia is now demanding rubles for gas, though they haven't followed through on their threats. Russia seems to be able to make it work, or at least willing to go head-to-head against these sanctions. What's happening now is that in the U.S., food prices are going up. We're expected to see some kind of major shortage. Fertilizer prices are through the roof, and so are gas prices. And you know what? We can blame Russia for a lot of this, but Joe Biden has a lot of the blame on his own hands because he made it harder for oil and gas companies to source fossil fuels. He shut down the Keystone Pipeline, which of course drove speculation, making gas prices go up. And of course, he banned fracking on public lands. You can argue those were good things. That's fine. I don't care to play this who's truly at fault game. The fact is, these moves have made certain things go into motion. And we're coming off of 2.5 years of a pandemic. Now we're seeing a war. And of course, all of the actions being taken are contributing to all of this. If Joe Biden, the United States, and NATO said, we will do nothing in response to Russia's invasion, the economy would not be nearly as bad. But invading is substantially worse than responding to the invasion. If Russia didn't invade, things would not be as bad. And now we are going to see the poorest nations begin to suffer first. But my friends, it will come here. We already saw food rationing in the U.S. during COVID. They're doing food rationing now in Spain. Food costs have already gone up 20 to 50% in some markets in Germany. And now we're learning that in March, global food prices are at an all-time high, up 13%. It's going to hit us, baby. Now we're being warned that recession signals are here. The United States may be in for a wild ride. And who do you blame? Blame whoever you want, okay? All of this stuff plays a role in everything. In everything. We can say, well, Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. And then people come out and say, yeah, well, the U.S. shouldn't have been meddling in Ukrainian politics. That's a border country for Russia. Yeah, I'm talking about what happened with Maidan, the protests in 2014. I was actually on the ground for the start of this, the ousting of Yanukovych, Joe Biden's illicit dealings. All of those things played a role. The U.S. is meddling in the Middle East. All of it reduces back to a point where it just seems like dominoes have been falling. And the only thing you can really do right now is prepare for yourself, your friends, and your family because the dominoes are coming down. I don't know where it ends. I don't know if anybody does. I don't know what moves will come next or who will contribute to the next piece of this collapse. But maybe we'll see stabilization. I think that would be fantastic. Considering right now that fertilizer costs are through the roof and so are gas prices, and people are already starting to riot, the night is always darkest before the dawn. And until we see some stabilization in Eastern Europe and in these countries, until we see prices coming down, the only thing I can assume is that it's likely going to get worse. For those of us in the United States, it ain't going to be that bad. I mean, we're overfed as it is. But it will be decently bad relative to where you are now, so pay attention and do what you can. Let's read the first story about what's happening in Peru, and then I want to show you this. This is from the Delco Times, the Daily Times, the fog of war, how some Russian sanctions backfire, and they are. Food prices are skyrocketing. That's the latest report from Reuters. Now, before we get started, head over to timcast.com to become a member and help support our work. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive episodes of the Timcast IRL podcast Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m., as well as the special members-only segments from our other shows. More to come soon. We've got the Green Room. We've got a weird conspiracy show, a talk show that we're going to be doing. And as a member, you're helping keep all of our journalists employed because that's how we fund the website, with you as members. But don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to this channel right now, and share the URL to this video anywhere you can. Click that share button. Grassroots marketing is how we get the job done. I've never marketed any of my news or political content. I think we might actually do a campaign very soon, but it's all been organic. It's all been thanks to you. Let's read the first story about what's happening in Peru. I've seen these videos that are going viral, and it's kind of crazy. People just ransacking a market. Wall Street Silver on Twitter says, Peru is facing a financial meltdown. Now grocery stores are being looted. Well, here's the story from CNN. Mind you, I love their headline. Mind the propaganda. The impact of Putin's war. There's a lot of impacts here. The geopolitical conflict has been going on for a long time. I think Putin should not have invaded, but there's a lot of factors at play, and we'll talk about them. CNN reports, and again, take it all with a grain of salt. An ongoing wave of violent protests in Peru shows how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting markets around the world, sparking unrest and deepening political divides. Rising fuel costs originally triggered the protest, which started last week, but quickly intensified into large anti-government demonstrations with marches and road blockades. By Wednesday, at least 6 people had been reported dead over days of protest, according to Peruvian authorities. As officials called for calm and struggled to contain the situation, at least 9 major roads in the country remained blocked by protesters. Late Monday, President Pedro Castillo declared a state of emergency and placed the country's capital under a curfew, but backtracked and withdrew the curfew order on Tuesday afternoon as hundreds of protesters ignoring the measure took to the streets of Lima to demand his resignation. Peru is not going through a good moment, Castillo said Tuesday after leaving a meeting with lawmakers, but we have to solve it with the powers of the state. Blocks away, police in riot gear used tear gas to dispel protests and demonstrators threw stones, with at least 11 people injured in the clashes. Peru is not new to political unrest. Over the last 5 years, the country has had 5 presidents, including one who was impeached and removed from office amid street protests. And Castillo himself has already faced and survived 2 impeachment votes since taking office in July. Last year, Castillo won the presidency on the thinnest of margins and faces a Congress in the hands of opposition, limiting his political capital and capacity to operate. But while Peru has been a fertile ground for protests in recent years, the crisis was triggered as a direct consequence of the war in Ukraine. CNN says, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and global leaders' consequential decision to isolate Russia from the world's oil markets sent the price of oil soaring. And for Peru, the impact has been particularly severe. Compared to other countries in the region, such as Argentina or Venezuela, Peru imports most of its oil. That left it more exposed to the recent spike, hitting the economy just as it was recovering from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. And we can frame this several ways. Putin's war. I'm sure in Russia, what they're reporting is the U.S. meddling in Ukraine and ousting of the duly elected government has resulted in a major upset. Russia, of course, defending its interests, blah, blah, blah. Now, my view on this is, I don't like the U.S. meddling in the affairs of Ukraine. I don't like Joe Biden saying, if you don't fire the prosecutor, you don't get the $1 billion. The prosecutor, who happened to be investigating a company called Burisma, among other things, where Joe Biden's son was on the board. At the very least, a conflict of interest. If you don't want to assume any illicit dealings, Joe Biden should not have been the man to do this. Ultimately, what happened in Ukraine resulted in the ousting of their president. Vladimir Putin then seizes Crimea. Now he's invaded the country. I think influence peddling and manipulation is shady, but it's not war. Offering money and loans in exchange for politicking, I think it's a bad thing, but it's not war. Russia was losing the influence campaign, and so they said, we go kinetic. I think Russia has more to be blamed for, but I'm not surprised that Western meddling on the Russian border has resulted in this degree of conflict. Blame whoever you want. I'm sick of playing the blame game. Trump was far from perfect. Joe Biden has a lot to answer for himself. All that matters, my friends, is that this is happening. Sanctions haven't worked. They've backfired. From the Daily Times, an opinion piece from Chris Fraind. He says, "There's no such thing as perfect men, only perfect intentions." Translation: no matter how well-intentioned actions often have unintended consequences. Nowhere is that more applicable than war. The West has made extraordinary efforts to support Ukraine after Vladimir Putin invaded, from supplying weapons to assisting with humanitarian crisis and imposing unprecedented sanctions. It has had the best of intentions, but the truth is, many of the ideas weren't fully vetted. In their rush to punish Putin, government and corporate groupthink ruled the day, often based more on emotion than methodical calculus. The result has been unintended consequences that have not only hurt citizens in America and Europe, but further empower Vladimir Putin and his war machine. And here we go. He's got several points, starting with this. Consider. Perhaps most short-sighted is the push for more embargoes on Russian energy. Even energy-independent nations incur significant price increases when sanctions are imposed, because highly volatile global oil markets are inelastic and subject to massive upward price swings in times of instability. The U.S. relied on Russia for only 3% of its oil needs. But when Biden ordered the embargo on Russian energy, gas prices spiked to all-time highs anyway, igniting more inflation. But the situation in Europe is far more dire, since many of its nations rely heavily on Russian gas. As a result, two things have occurred. Germany, as the world's fourth largest economy, yet an extremely energy-dependent nation, remains beholden to Russia for more than half its gas needs. As such, it continues to pump money into Russian coffers, funds the Kremlin can use to further its invasion of Ukraine. Critics, including Western nations, have pounced, deriding Germany for conducting business with Putin, a naive mindset detached from reality. Sure, the U.S. can supply Germany its gas needs, but that is years away, since more port facilities, pipelines, and other infrastructure need to be constructed. So it begs the question, if Germany shuts out Russian gas but can't immediately import sufficient energy, what's it supposed to do? Take one for the team at the expense of its citizenry? Charity starts at home, so how long would goodwill last if Germans freeze, run out of petrol, are forced to ration, watch their manufacturing plants shutter, and are laid off by the millions? The surefire way to shift public support away from Ukraine is to force immense hardship on those funding the anti-Russian war effort, which is exactly what will happen if Germany caves and embargoes Russian gas, oil, coal, and metals. 2. Energy-dependent nations arguing for Russian oil embargoes have forgotten that you can't run until you walk. You can't simply stop importing Russian energy if you don't have a backup. It's akin to America retiring the space shuttle without a replacement, a mind-boggling decision that made it totally reliant on, ironically, the Russians to access the U.S.-funded space station. Seems like it's happened before. 3. Western leaders calling for energy embargoes because of Russia's war crime need to look in the mirror. Under that rationale, how can those same countries still be conducting trade with China, given its horrific human rights violations? 4. Mr. Putin has threatened to seize control and potentially nationalize the assets of Western companies that pulled out of Russia. My favorite story is how all of the McDonald's restaurants they're shutting down were going to be changed. They're going to flip the M and turn it to a B and just take over these fast food chains, thus granting Russia probably billions of dollars in assets. 5. The Biden administration erred by demanding that China respect Western sanctions, warning of consequences should it support Russia. The only problem is that China has the upper hand and America is extremely vulnerable in a critical area. You see, what we end up getting out of these economic sanctions, Russia's recovered. They're making their economy more independent, more resilient because they have to be. The U.S. loves to give away money. Why? $12 million to Pakistani gender studies. Because if everybody has the currency, they want to use it. And if they want to use it, it creates confidence in the U.S. dollar as a U.S. reserve currency. That's why they do it. Meanwhile, U.S. labor foots the bill. But the truth is, we get most of our products overseas anyway. This may have all just been one big bad idea. I don't know how you respond to Putin. You're not going to go to war with them. Why sanction them and then destroy everything? Maybe to look strong? Here we go. From CNBC. is a recession on the way. These unconventional economic indicators may provide some clues. It's not just bond and stock markets that can signal an economic downturn. From the men's underwear index to the hemline index, there are also a number of more unconventional economic indicators that could be worth monitoring. Fears of a recession have been on the rise recently. Investors have become increasingly concerned that record high inflation amid the Russia-Ukraine war, coupled with the Federal Reserve's plans to aggressively hike interest rates, could slow economic growth. This deepening sense of unease has been reflected in the U.S. government bond market through what is known as a yield curve inversion, which has historically occurred prior to recessions. Investors have been selling out of short-dated treasuries in favor of longer-dated government debt, prompting 2-year bonds yields to rise above the 10-year rate. However, economists have stressed that an inversion in bond yields is by no means a guarantee of a recession. There's a slew of other economic data that can act as recession signals, including employment and consumer spending figures. Market watchers have also turned to more unusual gauges of economic health. I like this. The skyscraper index. British economist Andrew Lawrence developed the so-called skyscraper index in 1999. The measure links the construction of the world's largest buildings with the onset of an economic crisis. Lawrence said in a 2012 interview with a nonprofit council on tall buildings and urban habitat that he had looked as far back as the late 1800s and found correlations between the completion of the world's tallest buildings and economic crises. Notable examples include the completion of the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings in New York during the Great Depression. Lawrence explained that the completion of these skyscrapers tends to cap off what is a large building boom. However, he pointed out that it's not the tall building itself that is the issue, but rather when there is a cluster of these skyscrapers. We have the men's underwear index. For my former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, it's sales of men's underpants. NPR correspondent Robert Krulwich said back in 2008, amid the global financial crisis, that Greenspan had explained to him that because underpants were one of the last pieces of clothing men looked to buy, it acts as a good indicator of when times are hard. Greenspan had purportedly said that sales of men's underpants tend to be quite consistent, but dips in sales indicate that men's finances are so stretched they decide to hold off on buying the replacements. The hemline index, this is fascinating. When skirts become shorter, markets are on the rise and longer in downturns. The lipstick index. Estee Lauder chairman Leonard Lauder developed the lipstick index amid the economic downturn in 2001. He suggested that women would spend more on small luxuries like lipstick when times are hard. Now, I don't know if any of these things are indicative of anything particularly. I don't know if these metrics are insightful, but many people are pointing out weird things are happening that suggest we may be looking at a recession. Food prices will get worse. And when it gets worse in the United States, it will get worse everywhere else. And then we have a real fear. We have a real fear of war-related riots. Reuters reports food prices hit record high in March, UN agency says. And as I pointed out, the U.S., well, we tend to be well-fed, is the simple way to put it. And as people who are well-fed, we're not too concerned about rising food prices relative to poorer nations. I know most of you, though, are concerned. People have told me that they used to spend something like $400 a month on groceries, and now it's upward of $800 or $900. Some have said that they increased on average about $500 per month. And we're hearing that some expect monthly grocery bills, excuse me, to reach over $1,000. Reuters reports world food prices jumped nearly 13% in March to a new record high as the war in Ukraine caused turmoil in markets for staple grains and edible oils, the UN Food Agency said on Friday. The FAO's Food Price Index, which tracks the most globally traded commodities, averaged 159.3 points last month, versus an upwardly revised 141.4 in February. They go on to mention, Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat, corn, barley, and sunflower oil via the Black Sea, and Moscow's 6-week-old invasion of its neighbor has stalled Ukrainian exports. What I find fascinating in all of this is the detachment regular people have from where food comes from and how businesses operate. There's no magic. It's actually very, very simple. Some dude grows a bunch of wheat in a field. Over time, the wheat grows. A big truck comes and cuts it all up, throws it into a bin. They then send the bin to a distribution facility who puts it on a boat. The boat brings it to other countries, puts it on a truck. The truck delivers it to processing plants. Those plants then chop it up and make stuff with it. When you actually follow the supply chain, you'd probably, I think the average person living in cities would be surprised at how simple, in a sense, the process is. It's just people handing off things and then paying bills. It's not like it's magic. So the reason I mention that is it's very simple to disrupt. If one guy says, I can't buy, there's no movement. The supply chain gets disrupted. If a dude can't pump gas into his truck, food doesn't get delivered. It's as simple as that. I mean, think of it this way. You got to go to work. Gas is too high. You don't have enough money. You call your boss and say, look, I just can't afford to drive in. The work doesn't get done. That's it. To a lot of people I know, they're probably saying, Tim, we get it. It's really simple. But I got to tell you, and you go on Twitter and you hear what people have to say about like dairy delivery and processing. They really don't know that it is just a simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-step process. And when one of those processes is disrupted, the whole chain just collapses like dominoes. And that's where I think things are going to get really, really bad. Ukraine war-related inflation may drive protests and riots. We have this from The Guardian. That was the previous story from Reuters. Now to show you where we're going. Desperation amid food shortages in Shanghai as COVID lockdown bites. We're seeing something happen in a bunch of these cities. Once mocked by Biden, Russia's ruble emerges from the ashes. So what were the point of the sanctions? That, we're getting reports from Western sources. They're coming out and they're saying, the recovery is a trick. Russia's actually still doing bad. I don't know. Blame who you want to blame. Let's jump back to this Reuters piece, because there's something really interesting we can see here. The Arab Spring, they say in the story, refers to a series of pro-democracy protests and uprisings that began in 2010. Sudden spikes in food prices can lead to social unrest, as happened in 2007 and 2008 and again in 2011, when global food price increases were associated with riots in more than 40 countries. Agricultural commodities were already 35% higher in January compared with a year ago, and are expected to rise further due to the war, since Russia and Ukraine are both major exporters of wheat, maize, barley, and sunflower oil. Moscow calls its actions in Ukraine a special operation. Surging energy and food prices could also push policymakers to implement more subsidies, experts say, adding to their heavy debts of many low-income countries. So where could we be going? You know what I think? Poor countries are going to get hit really, really hard. We're going to see major riots and unrest and governments change. What should they do in Peru? They got to import gas, but the prices are too high. I mean, I feel like it's simple math. When you subsidize people, when that subsidy gets cut off, the people suffer. I've talked to friends about starving people in Africa. And I tell them, you know why we don't just dump food in Africa? If you have starving people and you give them food, they will flourish, correct? Right. They'll have kids. Then you have more people and they need more food. So do you give them more food, or you say, no, we've given too much as it is? If you take the food away, now these people can't survive. You have effectively created a dependent culture. So what's the answer? Information, education. That's why we don't just give food to starving nations. We teach them how to farm. We try to bring simple technology and methodologies to these people so they can farm better and sustain themselves. But maybe what we're looking at is some kind of great reset. If billions of people died, there would not be billions of people suffering under massive price increases in food and fuel. And there are some people who feel that way, legitimately, like if they could just reset things. Now, I don't know about any grand global plots or anything like that. I'm just saying sociopaths exist. Wealthy, powerful people talk about the need to reduce population. Bill Gates does. Bill Gates overtly says there are too many people. Now, he's not overtly said kill people. Bill Gates has publicly recommended that we stop having kids. We limit the amount of children that our countries produce to lower the amount of people on the planet. Well, that would alleviate some of the tensions. But Elon Musk went the other way. He said, if we don't have more people, the planet will collapse. You need more people to do the work, to produce the things, and to advance things technologically to make things easier. And as we do advance technologically, and as we develop more specialty jobs per person because there are more people, we can solve these problems and figure out ways to either leave Earth, produce more food, or find ways to continue expanding humanity. It seems like there are many people whose solution to all of this is less people. Just less people. Let humans reach 500 million population on the planet, so saith the Georgia Guidestones, and we end there. Elon Musk seems to be of the mindset that, no, we need substantially more people, more technology, more labor, and then we colonize the stars. I think Elon Musk said this. I wonder how many planets were single planet species, and they ceased to exist, wiped themselves out. I wonder. I remember watching that scene in the new Star Trek films. I think it was the reboot with, what's his name? Chris Pine or whatever. And he rides up on the motorcycle, and then you see this massive starship in a shipyard or something. I think that's what it was. If they were going to build ships, they'd be building them in outer space. But imagine you had 1 million laborers building this ship. Massive managerial power and financing because food was insanely cheap and being mass produced. So you just had a corporation of 1 million employees that build starships. It's kind of cool to think about. But then you would need massive space stations, massive energy supply. That's the future I'm interested in. Now, these people were concerned about overpopulation. The Great Reset types, the World Economic Forum types, seem to have little regard for humanity and where we could go. Or perhaps they don't. Perhaps they just feel that we need a renaissance. After the Black Plague in Europe, there was a renaissance. Technological advancement remained, but there were substantially less people, so there were more resources per person, and the strong survived, I guess. It's a horrifying prospect. I don't entertain any of that. I just think people can be strong if they're given the opportunity. I would love to see 50 billion human beings, multi-planetary colonies, starships built in outer space. I think it was Elon talking about this. Earth could collapse and then people from Mars could come over here and help rebuild. There would be people. The more people we make, the more people there are to advance science, to build, and to figure out better ways to survive. So in the end, I look forward to solving all of our problems, avoiding war. I think the people who advocate for like depopulation and say don't have kids, I think these people are dangerous. I don't think the planet is on the verge of collapse. I do think climate change is an issue. I do think too many people can result in population density related mass pollution, which can cause massive influx of certain chemicals, heat, or energy into a system, which can disrupt it. Perhaps the best thing we can do is decentralize out of cities. Over the Telegraph, they say artificial ruble surges despite fresh Russia sanctions, April 7th. Oh, there's also this one. Once mocked by Biden, Russia's ruble reemerges from the ashes from the same day. So who do you believe? Man, I don't know I don't know. Seeking Alpha writes, can U.S. sanctions on Russia backfire on the dollar's dominance? Seems to be the case. So what's the solution, my friends? I honestly don't know. I really don't. Cryptocurrency, maybe. Don't take financial advice from me. I bought Bitcoin. I'm happy with it. Reuters says ruble rallies on Moscow exchange, stocks up after new sanctions. The sanctions haven't worked. Seems to have made things worse. We fear riots are going to emerge around the planet. They're already starting to emerge in Peru. And what does that mean for the United States as summer comes? Every winter we hear the same thing. Oh, Antifa's dying down. Oh, the riots are stopping. And then summer comes and then there we go. Big riots everywhere. People start protesting. Now, in 2020, it was particularly bad. And I think this was because people were locked up and they went nuts over COVID. But then, like the Rat Utopia experiment, after they got it out of their systems and smashed everything up and went back inside, they were able to last a little bit longer. Now, seems the pandemic is faltering, but maybe coming back. Biden's federal mandates were reinstated by a federal judge in Louisiana, saying, like the CEO of a company, Biden has the authority to institute mandates for the people who work for the federal government. Maybe it'll all come back. I'm not sure. But if you combine war pricing, sanctions with COVID, man, I seriously hope you guys are getting ready for something bad to happen in fall. I don't know what you should do. I'll tell you what I did. I bought emergency food. Left made fun of me for it. I don't care. When food prices skyrocket, I'll already have bought the food, and I bought it substantially cheaper. So that's really the worst case scenario in the event nothing happens. Oh no, I bought food that was cheap and now it's more expensive. But the absolute worst case scenario for everybody is war spreads, the economy crumbles, people are fighting over a can of beans, and then I'll be forced to eat out of these emergency food buckets. That's the truly worst case scenario. But for everybody else who mocks the idea, their worst case scenario is fighting over the last can of beans in a Walmart parking lot. I don't know what you should do. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe next month, Vladimir Putin apologizes, withdraws his forces, Ukraine recovers, pandemic's gone, and everything just starts back up and returns to normal. I can't tell you the future. I don't want to tell you who's to blame or talk about any of that. Choose who you think has more blame than someone else. But pay attention to what's happening. Because regardless of who's to blame, regardless of who's firing what bullets, regardless of what Vladimir Putin or Joe Biden says, food prices are skyrocketing. Fuel prices are skyrocketing. And we are being warned it could lead to global unrest. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimcastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.